In a significant development for South Africa's agricultural sector, the Land Bank has announced a substantial reduction in its debt and loan book, cutting it by more than half as it prepares to emerge from over 4 years of default. This state-owned lender, which became the first major South African state entity to actually default on its debt in April 2020, has finally reached an agreement with its creditors to restructure its financial obligations. The bank's chief executive revealed that its debt has decreased from over 45 billion rand, approximately $2.5 billion, to about 16 billion rand, with plans to further ensure repayments in the coming years for the body. Now, Clive Ramathibela-Smith, senior executive partner, Hecare Capital and Partners, joins me to help us understand this better. Clive, it's nice to have you around.
Thanks very much, my brother. Appreciate him being here.
All right, so let's understand what actually led to Land Bank's default in April 2020.
Do you have enough time? There's so many things that went wrong with Land Bank about 4.5 years ago. One of the principal issues and matters that was obviously a conflict is the weighing or the evaluations that was done of the land audit that was provided by the previous government, which was obviously an apartheid state. And so what then happened is that, fast forward, some of those farmers and the owners did not necessarily keep intact with the evaluations of the land as they started to expand. And so some of the things that had to happen, for example, is look at rezoning the agricultural portions that were given to what we call the previously disadvantaged South Africans or Black South Africans. And the ownership is still very fine and wide if you look at in terms of the values that was provided at that particular time. The South African government then did its own evaluations to try and make sure that they can keep up with the fast-changing world of agriculture, particularly for arable land that was available. But because the banks were the biggest investors, or rather the lenders, the private banks, the commercial banks, that value was seriously undervalued, and that impacted on what the government was paying to be able to sustain the land bank and to be able to be profitable. That's one. The second part is, obviously, with the new generation of landowners, you have to make sure that you start assisting them. Remember, the objective of the land bank is to help entrepreneurs, to help new farmers, in particularly strengthening the Black farmers who are very small scale in South Africa. How do you make sure that you sustain them? So they wanted to give them cheap debt so that they can be able to start their businesses. But also you need to help them to make sure that whatever agricultural product that they're producing is sold at the same time, at the same rates as your normal commercial farmers would. That was a difficulty because obviously the evaluations were skewed against the Black farmers. And so the big farmers had an advantage because they already had shopping centers, shopping giants buying from them, whereas your small-scale farmers could not turn over as much as they could to make sure that they can pay on their respective debt. And so that created another issue and another problem. And to put a spanner in the works, or to put salt to the wound, then we had COVID, which completely destroyed Black farmers who are upcoming, who are very small in terms of number in the South African market. And that also made it difficult for them to pay or repay their debt to the land bank, making it impossible for them to be able to sustain those loans. And that's why they had to go into a default mechanism.
Oh, okay, so you just talked about COVID and a skewed evaluation, of course, in 2020. But then it's one thing for the Agric Bank to go into default. Then it's another thing for it to actually miss a restructuring deadline that was actually slated for March 2021 as at that time. So does it also have to do with this issue around the evaluation? Because there was meant to be a liability solution in talks with the partners or the creditors as at that time that did not materialize.
So where's the money? Where's the money from the land bank coming from? Who's funding them? In the majority, it's private bankers. So they have objectives. They have what we call, they have to secure the underlying asset. Land can be utilized in that particular factor, but it has to be evaluated appropriately, like you've just mentioned. And so the difficulty was to make sure that you meet that particular demand and meet the particular evaluation so that you can have the correct number spit out. But when you're using old-style apartheid regime lending tactics as a banker, you're going to have that. You find that you and I, as Black South Africans, will have higher rates than your counterparts who are white farmers who've been in the commercial farming space far much longer than you and I have been. That in itself was a disadvantage. But I can go even further, can go even deeper beyond just the interest rates being unfortunately critical to Black people, but also is the purchasing power contracts. Who gets the offtake? Who's going to buy my product? Who am I going to be selling to? And even if I do get a nice sponsor, sometimes because of the scale, because of the production I can only evaluate, I'm not able to actually get the kind of return that you would be expecting for a normal standard commercial farmer would need. I also need a far more robust infrastructure set up as opposed to my counterparts. So if I'm going to be doing citrus, I'm going to need serious structural reform to make sure that my infrastructure, my equipment, if I have agro-processing plant, I need to make sure that those things are up to scratch so that I can be able to be competitive with global markets. But if I don't have scale and I don't have a partner in a bank that assents me and that helps me, then I'm going to be in the same problem. And so these are the things that ultimately put the bank into a problem. But the mistakes that were made were also internal, like you're mentioning now. So who was doing the evaluations? The bank had people that were doing evaluations for them, and they were trying to help, but they didn't realize by trying to help them, they actually put themselves in the predicament where they are owing far more than what they were supposed to be borrowing.
That's quite interesting to know that a lot needs to go down into making the agri sector viable, most especially for the farmers. But then I'm just wondering, since 2020 till now, what has been the effect of the Land Bank's financial struggles on its ability to now support the agri sector, particularly in comparison to its peak support level of about 45 billion rand that was recorded, which has now fallen to about 17 billion rand?
Two things happened. So obviously now we have a government of national unity. I'm sure you're aware of that. Some of the critical things that have come from that is refocusing the land bank to try and make it more aggressive and more transformational. So they've been given a little bit more assistance from the government side, from National Treasury. And so that means that they've got a little bit more money to play around with. And then I don't mean that as in playing around. I just mean that there's a little bit more access to capital that's available there. They've also renegotiated the original debt, what we call primary debt. That's been renegotiated, and the payment terms have been renegotiated and extended. So what that means is that instead of paying until just 2025 or 2026, that's been extended to 2028. And so therefore, that makes it easier for them to be able to reduce their premiums on a monthly basis so that they can be able to meet their objectives. So those two aspects have critically assisted them. But there's also something very worrying that I think we should be aware of, is the fact that we still don't have enough Black farmers who are being empowered by the Land Bank. Part of the reason why the right-wing South African political aspects has been crying foul is because of the irrational way in which money has been utilized and not being able to empower Black farmers in the country. The Black Farmers Association has been talking about it. The Reformation Land Structure have been talking about it. We're hearing political parties such as the Economic Freedom Fighters talk about it. So there's a lot that needs to be still changed in the South African land reformation structure. And currently it sits with the new Minister of Agriculture, who happens to be the former opposition from the Democratic Alliance. And so he says that he needs to make sure that he changes a few things. And one of those things is to take the land bank from the National Treasury, which is the finance department, to his portfolio, which is the Department of Agriculture and Land Reform. So those things might be able to assist and change the critical aspects of Black ownership of land in the country.
So does that suggest that there's a bit of bias in terms of the funds being provided for who? in terms of maybe skin color, race, or maybe political affiliation. Is that what you mean by, of course, a skew in what is being provided in terms of finance and, not having enough black farmers having the kind of support needed to scale up their business?
I mean, we know, even on the African continent, that, our black farmers are far small and far too uncommercialized. So what happens is they rely on their counterparts, they rely on the white people, and it's not about race, it's about who should be given access to land. And the people have been working the land. They deserve to be actually at the forefront of the commercializations. But there still needs to be training. There still needs to be skills development. There still needs to be a lot in terms of entrepreneurial structure of how you do agriculture to become productive and profitable. And so the skewedness comes from all aspects, from land ownership, from access to capital, from export market to commercialization, making sure that you're profitable. Those things still haven't shifted enough. And so that's why there's still a little bit of a skewed favoritism towards our white counterparts, and our black farmers are still struggling. But they can work together. We've seen success stories. We've seen how retailers can be able to influence where they purchase and how they can empower black farmers to be able to be more sustainable. Remember, we need sustainability as part of the food chain, as part of the export market, to make sure that the African continent is still recognized. This continent is still the strongest agricultural arable land that you can have anywhere else in the world. And so if it's worked properly, we can still produce quality, but we need beneficiation to go back to its roots, to the people of the African continent.
Okay, so even as you said that renegotiations now have been ongoing, and now that Land Bank also is already in the process of cleaning up its debt. Now that the debt has been reduced about 16 billion rand, according to what we understand, how do you think this will impact the bank's overall financial stability and then even its lending capabilities to the sector?
When you restructure debt, there are targets that you need to put into place. That means that you cannot be as aggressive as you want it to be, which is one of my problems, is that because of the strict reforms that have been taken to try and consolidate the bank's debt, that might compromise the issue of transformation in the country. What do I mean by that? I mean that now the bank cannot just lend people money. They have to now understand that you are able to have a very constructive and profitable business plan or investment plan to go with that particular debt. They won't be able to splash out money as they used to do before. They now have to be very careful who they give that money to. Are these restrictions justified? Yes, perhaps they are, because of the debt problem that the bank is facing currently and that they're trying to reduce even further. But is it going to hinder on the transformational agenda? And that's definitely yes. It is going to hinder on that progress that was done over the previous period of time. And I think maybe one of the things that has been mentioned now in terms of what the bank wants to do is to reform at the agricultural space and make sure that things like triple BEE, for example, which was introduced for procurement of goods in South Africa, still can be expended without necessarily hindering on the progress that the bank has done in empowering black farmers. Also, the most important aspect of all of this is Land Bank's objectives, Land Bank's principles should not be altered simply because of its debt issues. There should still be more interaction or more availability of funds or capitalization of black farmers in the country, particularly women who are the bedrock of this particular agricultural sector. And I think if we can do that, then you have a better opportunity to expand on the greater scale the objective of the Land Bank and making sure that they still keep their debt in control while still empowering black people and females in the country.
Yeah, okay, so Clive, as we wrap up, talking about availability of funds now, we understand that some time back, the South African government provided some state bailouts for Land Bank during its default period in 2020. Do you think that would be coming into play to give it a bit of financial balance, even as it begins to, revive and recover in its operations and lending schemes?
That's already approved. So it forms part of what's been submitted to the National Treasury. And they've agreed in terms of what is required by the Land Bank to be able to be sustainable. That's all fair and good. The issue I have, my brother, is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when you try and focus on managing your debt, you compromise on the policies of why the institution was put into place in the first place. That's one. Two, when you disperse those particular funds, you put now red tape, additional red tape that might make it difficult for John Soap, who wants to start on Taganipo in KwaZulu-Natal in rural areas,
Well,
or in Vaba in the Eastern Cape to start, because now you have to be
okay,
making sure that he can be able to pay back that debt. So we
okay.
need to be very strategic of how the bank disburses its money and not forget its mandate to the people of South Africa.
Of course, and it would be needful for the South African government to ensure that, of course, the Land Bank does not get into another phase or state of being indebted to the point of going default again. Clive Ramathibela-Smith, our Senior Executive Partner, Hecare Capital and Partners, it was nice talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Have a lovely one.
And you too.